November 1942, somewhere near Leyte Gulf. The night hums with static. A nurse leans close to a trembling radio, the glow painting her face in pale amber. The rain has been falling for days, a warm, relentless drizzle that seeps into canvas and bone alike. The sea outside the tent sounds tired, each wave breaking with the weariness of a world that has been at war for too long. Inside, Lieutenant Margaret Holloway sits before a shortwave receiver, sleeves rolled, hands still smelling faintly of iodine. The field hospital around her is quiet now. The wounded are sleeping, or pretending to. The radio crackles again, a faint rhythm, almost like tapping from another world. To most, it would be noise. But to Margaret, trained once in basic Signal Corps code, before she chose nursing, it feels alive. She turns the dial, the hum deepens, and then a whisper of something structured. Dots and dashes, repeating, halting. She writes it down automatically, pencil trembling slightly. Light. The word forms on the page like a candle in fog. She does not know where the signal comes from. Officially, such transmissions are monitored by Army technicians stationed elsewhere. But unofficially, she listens every night. It began after the fall of Bataan, when reports of mass surrender drifted through headquarters like ghosts. Thousands of Americans were missing, and rumor said some were still alive somewhere north, in camps with names whispered more than spoken. Cabanatuan, Capas. The tent flap rustles. A sergeant passes by with a lantern, nods, but doesn't speak. Everyone knows she stays up late, after duty, chasing the air, they call it. They also know not to disturb her. Margaret adjusts the volume again. The signal fades, replaced by static, then returns, faintly stronger. More letters, names this time, or fragments of them. POWs, and then silence. She presses the pencil to paper anyway, sketching out the rest from instinct. Wilson? She doesn't know. Behind her, a row of cots breathes slowly. The wounded men, the feverish, the ones who mutter through dreams. Their murmurs blend with the rain until it sounds almost like the world itself is whispering. Margaret's world has narrowed to this. The steady pulse of duty by day, the fragile hope of a voice at night. Somewhere across the islands, men in tattered uniforms might be trying to send a message home, not knowing if anyone will ever hear. She wonders if they imagine someone like her, not a general or a signal officer, but a nurse with a notebook and too much faith. The rain softens. A faint scent of kerosene drifts through the air. Margaret lowers the headphones and exhales. The sound is gone now. Only the deep hum of the generator remains. She closes the logbook, its cover soft and worn from months of use. On the first page, she once wrote a single line in block letters, "If they speak, I will listen." She reaches for her canteen, takes a sip of tepid water, and leans back in the chair. Outside, thunder mutters low over the bay. She thinks of the map she saw earlier, little red pins marking lost battalions. Some of those men had been her patients once, before the retreat. Before the surrender, before silence swallowed them whole. The night stretches long. Somewhere beyond the static, in the dark heart of the Philippines, something, or someone, is still tapping. Margaret listens. The first time the pattern changed, Margaret almost missed it. The rain had stopped, and the night seemed too still, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. The generator stuttered once, then resumed its steady growl. She leaned forward, fingers brushing the dials, her pencil hovering over the paper. The code came in hesitant bursts, uneven but deliberate. Dot dash, pause, dot dash, dot. a fragment of language carried through tropical humidity and distance. She wrote quickly, translating as she went. The first line made little sense. God sees the hill. Then another. We wait for the light. It wasn't military code. It wasn't even formal Morse. It was something between message and prayer. When the night shift orderly passed by, Margaret closed her notebook. To anyone else, this was meaningless chatter, atmospheric echo most likely. Yet she had heard names before, fragments that matched lists of captured units. She couldn't explain it, but each signal carried something human in its irregular rhythm, like a heartbeat strained by fear. By morning, she brought her notes to the communications tent. Captain Whitmore, thin, sunburned, perpetually exhausted, skimmed the pages with a look of weary indulgence. "Interference," he said finally, handing them back. "You're picking up ghost frequencies. Manila stations bounce off the stratosphere this time of year. Static reflections." "But the patterns repeat," she insisted. "They use the same spacing every night. It's deliberate." Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lieutenant, we're short on quinine, morphine, and fuel. Don't add miracles to the list." She folded the papers and left without another word. Back in her quarters, the dawn light spilled pale over the canvas walls. The sound of aircraft engines carried faintly from the beach. Margaret set her notebook on her lap and traced the lines again. God sees the hill. The phrase lodged in her mind like a splinter. She didn't know why, but it felt anchored to something. A place, perhaps, or a desperate attempt to locate faith in coordinates. Days passed. She worked through fever wards, stitched wounds, rationed penicillin. But every night she returned to the radio. The signals came irregularly now, some nights a whisper, others a flood. Once she thought she heard a man singing, faintly off frequency, his voice blending with the static. She began transcribing everything, page after page, marking time and frequency, even the weather conditions. To her, each entry was a kind of vigil. A small defiance against the erasure that war demanded. Then came the night when her receiver erupted with overlapping taps. Frantic, broken, like someone pounding against metal. It lasted less than a minute. When it stopped, the air felt hollow. She realized she was gripping the pencil so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The next morning, Margaret overheard the intelligence officers whispering outside the mess tent. Rumors of new prisoner transfers north of Manila, near a place called Cabanatuan. She froze mid-step. The name had been in one of her coded fragments weeks earlier, almost buried within the dots and dashes. That night, she didn't ask for permission. She turned the receiver on early, long before curfew, and tuned into the same narrow band. The noise was faint, shifting, but she waited. Then, at 22:47, the tapping returned. Clearer this time, she recognized the spacing immediately. The same unseen hand, the same trembling rhythm. It spelled out the word light once more, followed by a string of initials. She wrote them all, slowly, carefully, as if afraid the page might burn beneath the pencil. When she was done, she whispered into the empty air, her voice barely above breath. "I hear you." The static answered with silence. The days blurred into a slow rhythm of heat, duty, and endurance. Margaret's world ran on two clocks, the hospital by daylight and the radio by night. At dawn, the jungle mist clung low to the ground, wrapping the tents in a thin veil. The wounded stirred, some calling for morphine, others whispering names of places that no longer existed: Bataan, Corregidor, Clark Field. Margaret moved among them with the quiet precision of habit. She cleaned wounds that refused to heal in the humidity, changed dressings, and wiped away fever sweat that smelled faintly of iodine and decay. By midday, the heat was suffocating. The air thickened with the scent of rot and antiseptic. The nurses joked softly between procedures, but their laughter carried a strange echo, as if they were trying to remember what it sounded like before the world fractured. When the last cot was checked, Margaret would retreat to her corner of the supply tent, pretending to inventory bandages. In truth, she was cataloging the signals, pages filled with strange fragments, "Hill bright at dawn," or "Rain ceased 3 nights." She had begun cross-referencing them with weather logs, and the matches were uncanny. The messages mirrored real conditions in northern Luzon, where the POW camps were rumored to be. There was order in the chaos, a fragile pattern of existence, not just for her, but for the voices she believed were sending them. Miles away, behind barbed wire and bamboo fences, the prisoners of Cabanatuan lived a rhythm of their own. Dawn roll calls, rice gruel at daybreak, forced labor until dusk. Dysentery and fever reduced strong men to shadows. Yet among them, rumor whispered of a captured radio, a crude device assembled from stolen parts, hidden beneath the floorboards of a latrine. Some said it worked. Others called it fantasy, but on certain nights, when the guards were drunk or distracted, faint taps echoed through the barracks, code exchanged between huts, faith transmitted in pulses too small to kill. One former Air Corps sergeant, skeletal and half-blind, kept time by the stars, counting seconds between signals. Another scribbled names of the dead into a scrap of paper, determined to send them out through the air, as if memory itself could travel faster than rescue. Margaret could never know their faces, but she sensed their desperation in the rhythm. The irregularities in spacing, the fading strength after midnight, human exhaustion written in electromagnetic breath. One evening, she caught herself whispering to the static as she tuned. "Come on," she murmured, "just one more word tonight." The receiver hissed, then cleared. A single pulse, then another. She leaned forward, heartbeat synchronized with the sound. "We wait for mercy." The message was brief, deliberate. It repeated twice, slower each time, as if the sender's hand was trembling. Margaret's throat tightened. She wrote it down, date and time exact. Then she sat motionless, afraid to breathe, afraid the sound might vanish for good. Later, as she walked to the infirmary to check the fever patients, she realized her own body had begun to mimic their struggle. Sleepless, gaunt, sustained by ritual alone. Listening had become her survival. The others noticed her fatigue. Lieutenant Dawson, another nurse, once caught her staring into the static and whispered, "You'll lose yourself in that noise, Maggie." But Margaret only smiled faintly. "Maybe that's where they are," she said. By late 1944, as the tides of war began to shift, so did the signals. They grew weaker, shorter. Some nights, nothing came through but static. She told herself the men were being moved, that silence didn't always mean death, but each empty night stretched longer than the one before. Still, she kept listening. Each dawn, when the rain began again and the camp stirred awake, Margaret would close her notebook and place it beneath her cot. The pages smelled faintly of pencil dust and salt. She had filled nearly 24 by now, a secret chronicle of unseen endurance. For the prisoners across the sea, survival meant breathing one more day. For Margaret, it meant keeping the channel open. By early 1945, the nights had turned strangely quiet. The radio hissed, but the rhythm was gone. Margaret stared at the receiver as if waiting for a heartbeat that had stopped. 3 weeks without a signal. 3 weeks of silence thick enough to feel like guilt. She tried to focus on her rounds, changing bandages, writing casualty numbers, keeping the wounded calm as rumors of liberation swept through the islands. Every few days, a transport arrived with survivors from Luzon, skeletal men wrapped in blankets, their eyes unfocused from months of captivity. She watched them step off stretchers, and every face seemed to ask the same wordless question: did anyone hear us? Her own answer stayed buried behind discipline. She still carried her notebooks, now sealed in a cloth satchel. Each night she returned to the receiver. The others thought she was sleeping. In truth, she was listening for ghosts. Then one night she heard it again, faint, intermittent, a thread of life tugging through the static. Dot dash. Pause. Dot dash dot. The same pattern as before. But now the message was shorter, almost broken. She leaned closer, pressing the headphones tight to her ears. "We wait under mercy." She whispered it aloud, repeating each syllable, tracing the rhythm with her finger against the wooden desk. Then, as quickly as it came, the signal vanished. Margaret sat back, heart pounding. The rational part of her knew this could be atmospheric bounce, an old recording, or another station bleeding through. But something inside her rebelled against logic. She was convinced, utterly quietly convinced, that she had heard living men. The next morning she brought her transcription to Captain Whitmore again. He didn't even look this time. "Lieutenant," he said wearily, "you've done enough night shifts. I'm reassigning you to surgical triage. Effective immediately. Stay off the radio." She stood motionless. "Sir, if these are signals, then intelligence will handle it," he snapped. "You're a nurse, not a prophet." His words landed with the dull weight of finality. She saluted, turned, and walked out. That night, for the first time, she didn't go to the communications tent. She stayed in the hospital ward, tending to burn victims under dim lanterns. But when the generator flickered and the rhythmic hum returned through the walls, she felt the familiar pull, the sound calling her name like conscience. At midnight she found herself outside again, standing barefoot in the damp grass, rain whispering over the tin roofs. The tent where the radio sat was dark, empty. She stepped inside, lit a lantern, and turned the receiver back on. The first sound was pure static. Then, a brief pulse, unmistakable. It was weak, distorted but real. She reached for the pencil, hands trembling. The code was fractured, half lost in noise. Only 2 words were clear. "Forgive us." Margaret froze. The message repeated once, then disappeared into the hum of the night. She sat there long after, staring at the paper. The meaning was impossible to ignore. The POWs had sent prayers across the air, but now they were confessing, or mourning, or both. Perhaps they had done something to survive. Perhaps mercy had demanded a price. The paradox pressed against her chest like a stone. Was listening an act of hope, or a sin of delusion? Margaret closed the notebook softly as if laying a body to rest. Her orders were clear, but the war had rewritten what obedience meant. She turned off the radio. The silence that followed was absolute. January 30th, 1945. The night smelled of smoke and wet soil. Word spread through the camp before dawn. The Rangers had done it. Cabanatuan had been liberated. Margaret heard the news secondhand, whispered by a medic racing through the ward. They found them. The prisoners, Americans, hundreds of them alive. For a moment, the world seemed to stop moving. She stood in the hallway, surrounded by stretchers and murmurs, her hands still stained with iodine. Alive. The word pulsed in her mind like the tapping of the Morse she had memorized. She felt the sting of tears before she realized she was crying. By mid-morning, the radio channels were alive again. Clear signals, official voices. Messages from the 6th Ranger Battalion confirming rescue and casualties. Numbers scrolled across the sheets. 513 survivors, dozens too weak to walk, all carried through the jungle to safety. Margaret didn't speak. She simply went to the corner of the communications tent and sat down before the same battered receiver that had haunted her for 3 years. The signal was strong now, loud and steady, the first true broadcast from Luzon since 1942. It wasn't code this time. It was a list of names. Her hands trembled as she wrote them, line by line, and then, halfway through, she froze. One of the names matched her notes exactly, CPL. Raymond L. Wilson. The same incomplete call sign she had heard months ago, the one she had filled in by instinct. It was him. He was real. Her throat closed. She listened until the end of the transmission, unable to move. The announcer's voice carried on, reading more names, thanking those who had waited. To most, it was military procedure. To her, it was proof that belief had weight. Margaret stood, her legs unsteady, and stepped outside. The dawn was breaking over Leyte, the horizon a thin band of gold over the sea. For a long time she just stood there, letting the light touch her face. Later that day, the medevac planes began arriving. She helped unload the first stretchers. Hollow-eyed men, wrapped in blankets smelling of rust and jungle rot. They spoke little, their voices barely more than whispers. One of them, his hands shaking, thanked her for water. "You're safe now," she said softly. He nodded, then murmured something she almost didn't catch. "We prayed someone would hear." The words struck deep, as if spoken through time. She looked at him, wanting to ask more, but the moment passed. The medics lifted him away toward the ward. That night she returned to her tent and opened her oldest notebook. The first entry, light, stared back at her like a promise kept. She traced it with her finger, then flipped through page after page. Every message, every plea, every fragment. They had been real, and yet the revelation didn't bring peace. It brought a kind of trembling clarity, that hearing them was not enough. Hundreds had died before rescue came. Their voices had crossed the void only to fade unheard by those with power. She had listened faithfully, but listening had not saved them. As she sat in the lamplight, the static returned, faint, unpatterned. It was nothing now but the hum of weather, the echo of a war winding down. Still, she listened, as if habit could hold back silence. Her hands rested on the logbook, the pages filled with the handwriting of a woman she no longer recognized. The faint pencil marks, the smudged dates, the desperate precision. They looked less like notes and more like prayer beads. She whispered once, not to the radio, but to the memory of those voices. "I heard you." The generator faltered, the light dimmed, and the static faded into the rhythm of the sea. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret turned off the receiver and did not turn it back on. Manila, September 1945. The war was over, but the air still carried the scent of fire and disinfectant. Whole blocks of the city lay in ruins, streets lined with husks of buildings, windows shattered like open eyes. In a converted convent near the bay, the American Field Hospital now served a new purpose, receiving men who had survived what few could imagine. Margaret walked its corridors every morning. The groans had faded. Now there were only whispers and the quiet shuffle of recovery. The prisoners from Cabanatuan were among them, men who had once been numbers, signals, and shadows to her. She passed their beds carefully, her steps measured as if afraid the floor might remember what it once was. The survivors spoke little. Some had forgotten how. Others talked without emotion, recounting hunger as though it were weather. One afternoon, while checking a transfusion line, Margaret heard a weak voice behind her. "You ever hear us?" She turned. The man was thin as paper, his wrists bandaged, eyes washed out by fever. His name tag read R.L. Wilson. Her heart caught. "I heard something," she said quietly. "Maybe echoes." He smiled faintly. "We used to tap when the guards were asleep. Said it was a prayer, not a signal. Just to know we weren't gone yet." His voice trembled on the last words. She didn't reply. She only adjusted his blanket and sat beside him until he drifted back to sleep. That night she opened her satchel and looked through the notebooks again. Dozens of pages marked by humidity and fingerprints. At the back of the last one she wrote a single line. He lived. Then she tied the books with string and carried them to the Red Cross archive across the compound. The clerk behind the desk looked puzzled when she handed them over. "Are these official records?" "No," she said softly. "Just something that was never supposed to be heard." She didn't sign her name. Outside, the bay wind smelled of salt and ash. She stood for a long moment beneath the flagpole, watching the stars emerge one by one. Planes droned faintly overhead, the sound of return, of endings. She thought of the thousands still unaccounted for, the ones who never found their way back. Her duty was finished. Yet silence followed her everywhere now, in the empty tents, in the wards, in the hum of the city rebuilding itself. Some nights she still dreamed of the radio, of tapping rhythms that turned into heartbeat and breath. One evening, as the sun burned low behind the wreckage of the harbor, she walked to the shoreline. The tide crept over her boots, the waves whispering the same cadence she had once heard through the static. She realized it wasn't a code at all, just the sound of persistence, of life repeating itself through ruin. Margaret stood there until the light disappeared completely. The world had moved on, but she carried its echoes. Fort Sam Houston Military Archives, Texas, 1972. The air conditioning hummed softly in the basement reading room. Rows of gray storage boxes lined the shelves, each labeled in fading black ink, Signal Corps, Philippines, 1942-45. A young archivist named Ellen Trowbridge lifted one down, dust rising like smoke in the fluorescent light. Inside, a bundle of notebooks wrapped in brittle Red Cross paper. No author's name, only a penciled note on the first page. Transmissions logged Southwest Pacific, source uncertain. The handwriting was firm at first, then trembled toward the end. Ellen flipped through the pages, her fingers grazing the soft indentations left by years of careful transcription. Each page was dated, timed, meticulous, the record of a listener who refused to stop listening. Then she saw it, a line underlined twice in faded graphite. "We wait for mercy." Below it, another entry, the same date, different hand, stamped from later annotation, January 30th, 1945. Cabanatuan raid confirmed. 5 or 13 prisoners liberated. She read it twice, then closed the cover slowly. The air in the room felt heavier. Later that afternoon, she walked the short distance to the military cemetery adjoining the post. Rows of white stones stretched to the horizon. She stopped at one. Lieutenant Margaret L. Holloway, Army Nurse Corps. Date of death, 1951. No next of kin listed. A warm breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and rain. Ellen stood in silence, the sound of distant aircraft echoing faintly overhead. She thought of the notebooks, of the invisible thread running between the woman who had written them and the men who had lived because someone, somewhere, had kept faith with sound. No speeches, no monuments, only the quiet endurance of a listener who had chosen to hear when others turned away. Back inside, Ellen placed the notebooks into an archival sleeve and labeled the file. Unverified field transmissions, 1942-45, probable monitoring of Cabanatuan region. It would sit on a shelf, seldom opened, its meaning waiting for someone who still believed that listening mattered. Years later, the story would surface again. A footnote in a declassified report, a passing mention in an oral history. Historians would debate whether the transmissions were real, whether the frequencies even reached that far. No one could prove it, but in every retelling, the pattern remained. A signal, a nurse, and a silence broken only by faith. If you listen to old field recordings from the Pacific Theater, static layered with distance and storm, sometimes you can almost hear it. A faint tapping beneath the noise. A rhythm too human to be mechanical. ... Pause. Then nothing. The hum of the machine fades, replaced by the breath of the room itself, air, time, memory. Somewhere across 30 years and an ocean, the sound has already reached its destination, because every voice once heard leaves an echo, and sometimes that echo is all history has left to prove it ever happened.